Okay, this is Block 7, The Greatest Generation, Section 5, the home front, with the section beginning Black Americans in World War II. World War II is kind of the jumping off point, if you will, for the end of official American racism in the form of segregation in the South. It's going to take a little while to happen, but the seeds of the civil rights movement are directly traceable back to the Second World War. Black Americans see the Second World War as an opportunity to prove, again, their citizenship, and they look at it as an opportunity to get better treatment both during and after the war. If you remember from our previous blocks, racism in America is a national issue now, as millions of blacks have moved north and they live in American cities. They live in kind of ethnic neighborhoods in every single northern city. They are working by the thousands in northern factories. All Americans, if they go about their daily business, interact with black American citizens, and that had simply not been the case, up until the 1910s and 1920s. So race relations are now a national problem, not just a Southern problem. And to prove that, race riots in Detroit in 1943 killed 25 blacks and 9 whites. There was race riots in St. Louis in the course of the war. For black Americans, in the long run, American success over the obviously racist Adolf Hitler gave black Americans a rhetorical device to fight for equal treatment. Black Americans could easily say, we put 12 million men in the field to defeat, this racist dictator. How can we continue being racist here at home? And it was a question that really there was no good response. Nobody liked Hitler's racism, and then to be outwardly racist, back home in the United States gave most people pause. And black Americans exploited this obvious contradiction, to their benefit. How can you possibly, fight racism, in the distant corners of the world, but accept racism here at home? The rallying cry for black Americans then became double V, and the V sign is indicative. Churchill popularized the two fingers, and it's come to mean peace. But in the Second World War, Churchill would flash this sign, and it would mean victory. Whenever crowds were cheering and waving, Churchill would flash the two fingers to give the victory sign. And that became kind of a watchword for victory throughout the course of the war. Black Americans said, well, let's take that and kind of one-up it. And the double V for victory became the rallying cry of black Americans and their white allies who sought the end of racism in America. And what it means is victory against dictators abroad and victory against racism at home. The battle towards equality begins during the Second World War. Blacks continue to migrate north to work in the factories. They work in key war production facilities, key war production factories, but they are being paid less than their white counterparts. For the first time, a black leadership is kind of confident enough and strong enough to outwardly say, we're not going to any longer work if we're not paid and treated as equal human beings. A black leader by the name of A. Philip Randolph threatened what he called a Negro March on Washington in 1941 to demand equal opportunities in war jobs. He said, black Americans have the same right to work in a factory as any other Americans, and not only that, they had the same right to get the same amount of money and the same amount of benefits and the same amount of workplace safety as any other Americans, risking their lives in factories, building things for the war effort that was needed to defeat the racist Hitler and the racist Japanese abroad. Roosevelt was always interested, or very often interested, often with his wife's urging, in advancing the cause of civil rights. And what Roosevelt did in this regard, he responds with an executive order forbidding discrimination in defense-related jobs. That black Americans working in a factory building, bombers, had to be paid the same amount of money as white workers working in that factory making bombers. And he was not just a toothless declaration. Roosevelt established another federal bureaucracy, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, or the FEPC, to enforce this. And this is an important step in the march towards workplace equality and then greater economic and social equality for black Americans. Now, after this law, black Americans could complain to this commission that they were being paid less, treated unfairly, etc., etc. And it was obviously staffed by Americans, both black and white, who thought that American racism should come to an end. And so complaints to the FEPC were followed through and acted upon in most of the time. It was not just in war industries that black Americans had their power and their strength and their numbers felt. It was in the field as well. Black Americans were drafted into the armed forces just the same as white Americans, but for the most part they were given menial jobs. They were not given frontline jobs, they were given menial jobs. Flying in the face of evidence established during the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, in World War I, black Americans were given non-combat roles for two main reasons. The first reason was many Americans did not like the idea of black people learning how to use weapons. They thought that that could lead to problems after the war in terms of unrest or in terms of riots. And secondly, and a little less, conspiratorially, lots of whites still believed that blacks just couldn't be good soldiers, that they didn't have the initiative and the moral courage that white Americans had. And so this attitude prevailed in the Army. The Army was segregated, and because the Army was segregated, blacks and whites did not fight together. Blacks were given menial jobs. They were cooks, they were dishwashers, they worked in supply. One moment of glory came on what was known as the Red Ball Highway. After the invasion of the Allied invasion of France in 1944, supplies had to get to the Allied troops as they were advancing across Europe. But since the Americans and the Brits hadn't yet conquered a big enough port, stuff had to be kind of offloaded onto the beach and put in trucks and driven up to the front. And the trucks had to move at night. They were blacked out. They put tape over the headlights, and the trucks just went bumper to bumper for hours on end across these little narrow French roads carrying supplies, largely driven by black Americans. And without them, the tip of the spear, the army that was doing the actual fighting, would not have been able to fight. And that was simply a fact that, all these jobs, even though they were menial service jobs, they were vital to the war effort. And the Americans who drove those trucks on the Red Ball Highway were just as responsible for victory as anybody else. More famously were the Tuskegee Airmen. There were some groups of black soldiers who actually got to fight on the front lines. And this is the most famous example. This were a group of volunteer black American soldiers who joined the Army Air Corps and who flew these P-51 Mustangs in combat over the skies of Europe with much skill and much elan. Here is a stylized painting. These P-51s were long-range fighters. They were tasked with escorting the bombers, flying bombing raids over German territory, and these black airmen did very, 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 very well. Unsurprisingly, there's lots of good pilots of any color. And they shot down large numbers of German planes and protected the bombers who had their job to do to destroy German industry. And this was kind of the highlight, if you will, of the black experience during the Second World War in terms of giving black Americans the sense that, yes, they could be good soldiers, yes, they could play a role, yes, they ought to have confidence in themselves and their abilities. And this confidence in themselves and their abilities and their role in winning the war against Hitler is going to play a huge role in allowing black citizens to finally stand up for their rights and demand that the United States live up to its own ideals. The black experience in World War II really sets the ball in motion on the road to civil rights. And without World War II, it likely would have been delayed even more. The most important thing is this rhetorical weapon, like we talked about. The idea that how could the United States fight a war against this obviously racist dictator Hitler and still be so obviously racist at home? And that will start and set things in motion that will lead to one of the greatest glories of American history, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s.